2 years ago, I told you that Brad Raffensperger was just a Republican vote suppressor, and boy, was I right. Welcome back to Democracy Docket. I'm Marc Elias.
And I'm Paige Moskowitz. Let's get started.
Paige, I feel like I was early to this. You know, when everyone was lauding Brad Raffensperger, the Georgia Secretary of State, who famously refused to commit felonies, by the way, felonies that he didn't have the power to commit, by finding votes that didn't exist after the 2020 election. A lot of people heralded him as a hero, that here is this Republican Secretary of State who stood up to Donald Trump. I, on the other hand, always took a more jaundiced view of what he did, which was, in my view, like I said, not committing felonies. Plus, he couldn't find 11,000 votes. Those votes didn't exist. But here we are, Paige, now in 2025, and he is back in the news, back in the pages of Democracy Docket, because he is just a Republican vote suppressor.
Right. The latest update is that Raffensperger has sent letters to new Attorney General Pam Bondi and new Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem. He's asking Bondi to drop the DOJ's lawsuit challenging a voter suppression law in Georgia and to defend the state in other voter suppression cases. And he's asking Kristi Noem to give the state greater access to a citizenship verification program, again, compounding on the Republican lie that there is a mass amount of non-citizens who are voting in the United States, but it's really just an excuse to suppress voters.
Yeah, so let's take the first one, because again, it is something we have flagged before at Democracy Docket. Democracy Docket has written about it. If you are not already if you have not already subscribed to Democracy Docket, take an opportunity right now to click on the link above or in the notes below, and you will become a free subscriber to Democracy Docket, and you will be kept abreast of everything happening to democracy in court, as well as who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. But we flagged this, Paige, because Brad Raffensperger has been appealing a couple of cases that the state of Georgia lost involving redistricting under the Voting Rights Act. And he is trying to gut the Voting Rights Act, like in his name. Like, he can point to the Attorney General, whatever, but his name's in the caption. And he has been trying to gut the last remaining protections that people have in the Trump era under the Voting Rights Act. It is absolutely shameful. It should be front page news in all the legacy media, but frankly, so many of them fell in love with him. You're not going to get that kind of news in legacy media, which is why you need outlets like Democracy Docket.
We have talked about this issue before. It's called a private right of action. You can click the link above to watch our prior video on this. But essentially what it is that it's the right of private voters and groups to challenge unfair election laws in their states. Brad Raffensperger says that private voters and groups shouldn't have the right to do that. Only the DOJ should be allowed to sue when states violate federal voting rights laws. But now, backing up his claim that he loves voters and is such a great guy, he's asking the DOJ to drop a lawsuit that was filed under the Biden administration challenging a Georgia law, SB 202, that does a lot of things, but some of the biggest provisions it does is that it shortens the absentee ballot request timeline, adds new restrictions for drop boxes, and bans what's called line warming, which is passing out food and water to voters waiting in long lines.
Right. So everyone needs to understand the two-step game here that he's playing. In one set of courthouses, he is saying only the Department of Justice can file lawsuits to vindicate the rights of voters who have been the subject of racial discrimination in voting. Okay, that's what the Voting Rights Act protects, right? It protects it against racial discrimination in voting. And so, in the one hand, he's saying only the Department of Justice can bring those cases, not private litigants, not voters who are affected, not the NAACP, not any group, only the Department of Justice, which, by the way, is now run by Pam Bondi, so there'll be no lawsuits. Then, on the other hand, he's saying, oh, and by the way, the case that the Department of Justice brought to protect Georgia voters from racial discrimination in voting, you should drop it. You should drop that one, right? So, like, what does he want? What he wants is that Georgia can pass bad voting laws. He wants that Georgia can discriminate against Black voters. He wants that Georgia can pass illegal districts and discriminate in their districting. He wants there to be the kinds of laws that Republicans have been salivating about enacting around the country around the country. Some of them were enacted in Georgia, SB 202, which was the subject of protests. The All-Star game was moved by Major League Baseball. The law was so bad. There were lawsuits. Some of those lawsuits have been successful. Georgia has gone back since then and passed more voter suppression laws. Georgia has gone back and made it easier to challenge voters, make it harder for people to vote, easier for Republicans to cheat. And Brad Raffensperger, on one hand, is saying, oh, no, only the Department of Justice can bring these cases. On the other hand, hey, DOJ, stop bringing the cases. And he knows that Pam Bondi for the next 4 years, with Harmeet Dillon as head of the Civil Rights Division, they're not going to be bringing any lawsuits protecting voters. They're not going to be bringing any lawsuits protecting minority voting rights in Georgia. So this is an absolute scandal that the legacy media ignores because, like I said, they feel, Paige, like they got to find some Republican who they can lavish praise on. They can't bear the idea that there isn't some Republican out there who isn't good on voting rights. So they laud praise on these Republicans when, in fact, Brad Raffensperger is just a Republican vote suppressor. He's sucking up to MAGA just like the rest of them. And so shame on the legacy media for the job they've done. And please, this is why you all need to support independent media, whether it's Democracy Docket or it's any of the other, any number of other independent media sources. You need to support the ones that are not being dominated by corporate media that feels the need to do both sides coverage.
Marc, you threw a new name into the mix, so I want to highlight it. People know Brad Raffensperger, Georgia Secretary of State, vote suppressor. They know Pam Bondi, former Florida Attorney General, now U.S. Attorney General, vote suppressor. You mentioned Harmeet Dillon and her anticipated new role as head of the Civil Rights Division of the DOJ. Who is she and what should people know about her?
Oh, man. I mean, Democracy Docket has written some great pieces about Harmeet Dillon, and so we'll put those in the notes as well. But Harmeet Dillon, is a Republican Party lawyer from the MAGA wing of the party. She actually ran against Ronna McDaniels for chair of the RNC on a platform that she would be a bigger vote suppressor. She would bring more anti-voting litigation than Ronna McDaniel will. Now, what's interesting is that Ronna McDaniel won that election and then was subsequently replaced by Mike Whatley because Donald Trump looked and said, yeah, Ronna McDaniel's not bringing enough voter suppression litigation. So that's who she is. She has represented, some of the worst of the anti-voting crowd. She was closely associated for a while with Kerry Lake in Arizona and that nonsense. And so this is who Donald Trump wants to be in charge of the Civil Rights Division, in part because the voting rights section is within the Civil Rights Division. And I'm just here to tell you, there's not going to be, for the next 4 years, any enforcement of voting laws out of the Department of Justice. There may be efforts by the Department of Justice to be on the other side, to actually attack voting laws, to actually attack voting rights, but there's not going to be any pro-voting actions out of that Department of Justice. And so when Brad Raffensperger, takes these positions, he knows who he's pitching to. He's not pitching to the Biden administration on a good faith basis about what the law is. He's pitching to people who are going to shut down voting, are going to undermine free and fair elections in this country.
And in this letter, Raffensperger made a second request to DHS Secretary Kristi Noem to get greater access to people's citizenship information.
Yeah, and we know that that's because Brad Raffensperger is on the program when it comes to these bogus, proof of citizenship laws, which, are really nothing other than an effort to make it harder to register to vote. And Paige, I might note that for all these folks like Brad Raffensperger who are like, oh, we need people to prove citizenship. We need people to prove citizenship. And then they turn around and they say, oh, it's really simple, just your birth certificate. Well, I mean, we've talked before about why that will target young voters, how it discriminates against women who get married and change their last names, how it imposes a tax for people who have to get copies of them and pay money, right? All that. But guess what? President Trump now wants to do away with birthright citizenship. What will that mean? It will mean a birth certificate won't count either. Just wait. They're going to say a birth certificate's not good enough to prove citizenship if they win on birthright citizenship. Now, good news is they're not going to win on the birthright citizenship lawsuit, but it just goes to show you this whole thing on their side is all a game. They want to make it harder for people to vote. They want to make it harder for young voters in particular to register to vote. They want to make it harder for women in particular to make it to be able to vote. And it is a shame that Brad Raffensperger is now in on that game as well. But that's what we expect from any elected Republican today, Paige, because if you are not a MAGA true believer on voter suppression and election subversion, then you have no place in the Republican Party. Thanks, everyone, for watching this episode of Democracy Docket. We will see you next time, but please make sure you are subscribed to Democracy Docket's free daily and weekly newsletter.